back to Erased But Not Gone, the channel where we uncover the histories they tried to silence. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, your city and your country. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe now and like this video. Your support helps this channel grow. Now let into our story for today. In the dry winds of West Africa, along the banks of the Senegal River, there was a land called Futa Toro. It was a place of scholars, farmers, traders, warriors, and spiritual leaders. But in the late 1700s, it became something else. It became a battlefield over the soul of a people. This is the story of Abdul Kader Kane, an Islamic scholar in his mid-40s, who in 1776 made a decision that would shake the foundations of slave trading networks in West Africa. While European ships waited on the coast to buy human beings, and local rulers grew rich from selling captives, one man stood up and said no more. But who was he? And how did he gather the courage to challenge a system that enriched kings and empires? Stay with me, because this story is not just about resistance. It is about faith, power, betrayal, and a war declared not for land but for human dignity. Futa Toro was located along the Senegal River in what is now northern Senegal and southern Mauritania. The river was life. It fed the crops. It supported cattle. It connected inland communities to the Atlantic coast. For centuries, this region had been home to the Fulani people, also called the Fula. They were known for cattle herding, scholarship, and deep Islamic learning. Islam had spread across West Africa long before European ships arrived. Scholars studied the Quran. Judges applied Islamic law. Teachers trained students who would later guide communities. But while faith grew stronger inland, something darker grew along the coast. European traders from Portugal, France, Britain, and the Netherlands had built trading posts. They brought cloth, guns, metal goods, and alcohol. In return, they demanded gold, ivory, and most of all, human beings. The transatlantic slave trade was expanding rapidly in the 1700s. Millions of Africans were captured, sold, and shipped across the ocean. But many people do not know that some African rulers participated in this trade. They raided neighboring communities. They sold prisoners of war. They exchanged human lives for weapons and wealth. This created tension inside African societies. Some leaders supported the trade. Others condemned it. Abdul Kader Kane was born into a world where this tension was growing. He was educated in Islamic scholarship. He studied religious law. He understood deeply that Islam forbids the unjust enslavement of fellow Muslims. Yet in many parts of West Africa, slave raiding did not stop at religious boundaries. Villages were attacked. Families were separated. Children were taken. Entire communities disappeared. And as the trade expanded, more guns entered the region, making raids more violent and more frequent. By the time Abdul Kader Kane reached his mid-40s, the situation had become unbearable. Futa Toro itself was divided. Some elites were benefiting from trade connections. Others feared moral collapse. There was growing anger among religious scholars who believed rulers had abandoned Islamic principles for profit. The people whispered that their leaders had forgotten God. And in times of moral crisis, people often turned to scholars for guidance. In 1776, Abdul Kader Kane emerged as a leader during a movement often called a jihad. But in this context, it was not simply war. It was reform. It was a struggle to purify governance and end corruption. Scholars and supporters rallied behind him. They challenged the ruling elite. They accused them of participating in the slave trade and ignoring Islamic law. Tension turned into confrontation. Confrontation turned into conflict. What made Abdul Kader Kane different from many rulers of his time was his clear position against selling free Muslims into slavery. He declared that it was unlawful. He declared that leaders who profited from such actions were betraying their faith. And in doing so, he directly threatened powerful interests, because the slave trade was not only a coastal activity, it reached deep inland. It connected chiefs, merchants, and foreign buyers in a chain of profit. To disrupt it meant challenging an entire economic system. Imagine the risk. Guns were flowing into West Africa from Europe. Rival leaders were armed. Coastal traders depended on captives. And yet this scholar stood firm. He declared war not for conquest, but to reform society. He aimed to establish a theocratic state governed by Islamic law. A state where unjust slave raiding would be stopped. A state where moral leadership would replace corruption. But power never changes hands peacefully when wealth is involved. Those who profited from slave trading did not sit quietly. They resisted. They plotted. They accused him of ambition disguised as piety. They claimed he wanted control. The region became unstable. Alliances shifted. Communities chose sides. What makes this story even more powerful is that Abdul Kader Kane did not fight European ships directly. Instead, he targeted the supply lines. He focused on internal reform. He understood that if African leaders stopped selling their own people, the trade would weaken. It was a bold strategy. It was dangerous. And it required not only military strength, but spiritual authority. As conflict grew, battles erupted within Futa Toro. Supporters of reform clashed with defenders of the old order. Blood was spilled. But gradually, Abdul Kader Kane consolidated power. He became Almami, a religious ruler. And once in authority, he began implementing policies to restrict slave trading in his territory. This was not symbolic. It had economic consequences. Coastal traders complained. Neighboring states watched carefully. And here is where suspense deepens. Because when one region disrupts the slave trade, others may step in to fill the gap. Would his reforms survive external pressure? Would rival states attack? Would European traders retaliate indirectly by supporting his enemies? The story is about to grow more complex. In the years that followed 1776, Abdul Kader Kane tried to reshape governance in Futa Toro. He promoted religious scholarship. He enforced Islamic courts. He restricted certain slave transactions. But resistance did not disappear. Internal divisions continued, and external threats grew. This was not a simple hero story. It was a fragile reform movement, balancing faith, politics, and survival. Abdul Kader Kane stood at the center of it, a scholar turned ruler, a reformer in an age of expanding slavery, a man who believed that stopping injustice began at home. But the question remains, could one inland Islamic state truly slow the tide of the Atlantic slave trade? Or would economic forces crush his efforts? As we advance, we will explore the rival clans, the influence of neighboring states, and the European presence that complicated every decision. We will see how reform can ignite hope, but also spark dangerous opposition. If you are still watching, write "Freedom begins at home" in the comments. Like this video. Share it with someone who believes Africa had no resistance to the slave trade, and subscribe to Erased But Not Gone. Futa Toro, in the years before 1776, was not a simple kingdom ruled by one unquestioned authority. It was a layered society shaped by clans, scholars, warriors, farmers, and herders. And understanding the structure is key to understanding why Abdul Kader Kane's rise was both possible and dangerous. Along the Senegal River, villages stretched in long lines near fertile land, while beyond them, cattle moved across dry plains under Fulani herders who had traveled those routes for generations. And above local village leaders stood regional elites who claimed noble lineage and political. influence, some of whom had built strong ties with the coastal traders who demanded captives in exchange for firearms and goods. The river itself was not only a source of life, but a corridor of trade, connecting inland markets to the Atlantic coast, where European ships waited. And with every canoe that moved downriver carrying grain or cloth, there was the possibility that human beings would also be moved in chains. This created a silent tension in the region because while some leaders enriched themselves, ordinary families feared raids, and fear changes how people think about authority. Abdul Kader Kane did not step into leadership in a vacuum. He emerged from a class of Islamic scholars known for deep study and moral authority. And in Futa Toro, religious learning had long been respected. Quranic schools trained children. Judges applied Islamic principles to disputes, and scholars often served as advisors to rulers. Yet when rulers ignored religious limits in pursuit of profit, those same scholars could become critics. In the decades leading to 1776, complaints grew louder. Scholars accused certain elites of selling Muslims into slavery despite Islamic law forbidding the unjust enslavement of believers. And they argued that greed was corrupting the land, turning brother against brother. Some nobles dismissed these warnings, claiming that political survival required weapons, and weapons required trade, and trade required captives. But this logic ignored the moral cost, and among the people, anger simmered quietly. Abdul Kader Kane began gathering supporters not through sudden rebellion, but through teaching, discussion, and persuasion. He moved among villages speaking about justice, about the responsibility of rulers before God, about the spiritual consequences of oppression, and slowly his message resonated, especially among those who had suffered from raids or feared losing their children. This movement was not simply political, it was deeply religious, framed as a reform struggle to restore proper governance under Islamic law. And this gave it legitimacy beyond clan boundaries because faith can unite where lineage divides. Yet unity is fragile, and those who stood to lose power saw the danger clearly. They knew that if a reformist state took control, it would cut off profitable trade connections, and they feared economic decline, and so resistance formed quickly. Rival leaders accused Abdul Kader Kane of seeking personal dominance under the cover of piety. They warned that his strict interpretation of law would disrupt long-standing alliances, and they reached out to neighboring rulers for support. The region of Futa Toro was surrounded by other political entities, some friendly, some competitive, and the balance of power was delicate. And when reform movements arise, neighbors often calculate whether to intervene or wait. In 1776, open conflict broke out as reform supporters confronted established elites, and battles erupted along the river valleys, small in scale compared to later wars, but intense in local impact. Families were divided by allegiance. Villages fortified themselves, and the question of who would rule Futa Toro became urgent. Abdul Kader Kane's supporters were disciplined and motivated by religious conviction. They believed they were defending justice rather than pursuing conquest, and this belief strengthened morale, because fighting for faith can sustain courage even when resources are limited. Gradually, the reformists gained ground, and Abdul Kader Kane was declared Almami, a religious leader with both spiritual and political authority. And this moment marked a turning point because now reform ideas had to transform into practical governance. Becoming ruler meant facing hard realities, how to maintain security without relying on the same trade networks he condemned, how to defend borders in a region flooded with firearms, how to prevent internal dissent from erupting again, and how to enforce restrictions on slave trading without provoking economic collapse. One of his early priorities was establishing Islamic courts. To regulate disputes and enforce legal principles, this strengthened his legitimacy among scholars and ordinary people. But it also challenged nobles accustomed to flexible interpretations of power. He moved to restrict the sale of free Muslims, especially those captured unjustly. And this policy disrupted relationships with traders who had grown used to steady supplies, and complaints traveled quickly toward the coast where European merchants depended on intermediaries inland. Though Abdul Kader Kane did not confront European ships directly, his policies indirectly threatened their operations, and European traders were pragmatic. They sought profit above ideology. So if one region closed supply, they looked elsewhere. But they also supported local allies who could maintain access. And this meant that internal enemies of the Almami might receive quiet encouragement from outside forces. Suspicion grew on all sides. Reformists worried about conspiracies. Nobles feared further restrictions. Traders watched closely. And the people waited to see whether promises of justice would hold firm. Leadership under moral conviction is inspiring, but it is also isolating, because compromise can dilute principle, and rigidity can provoke backlash. And Abdul Kader Kane had to navigate this tension carefully. He strengthened alliances with other reform-minded regions in the wider Senegambian area, hoping to build a network of states committed to Islamic governance. And this broader vision added another layer of suspense, because if reform spread, it could reshape trade patterns across West Africa. Yet expansion could also trigger wider conflict. Stories circulated of his firmness in court, of judgments that favored justice over noble privilege, and this won him loyalty among common people. But elites murmured that their influence was shrinking, and when influence shrinks, power struggles intensify. The Senegal River continued flowing calmly as political storms gathered. Boats still traveled, markets still operated. Yet beneath the surface, uncertainty was constant, and every decision carried risk. Would his state endure or fracture under pressure? Would neighboring rulers attack to weaken reform? Would economic strain turn supporters into critics? And most importantly, could the Almami truly reduce the capture and sale of people in a region entangled with Atlantic demand? The answers were not immediate, and the struggle ahead would test not only military strength, but spiritual resilience, because reform is hardest when profit tempts and fear spreads. As we take keen look, we see Abdul Kader Kane not as a distant symbol, but as a leader surrounded by complexity, balancing faith, power, economics, and survival, in a land where one policy could change the fate of thousands. As we journey further, we will explore the external pressures that began closing in on Futa Toro, the neighboring states, the expanding European presence, and the quiet strategies that could either protect or undermine his vision. If you are still here, write "Justice over Profit" in the comments. Share this story with someone who believes resistance to slavery did not exist in Africa. And stay with Erased but Not Gone as we move deeper into the storm surrounding Abdul Kader Kane. As Abdul Kader Kane settled into his role as Almami of Futa Toro after 1776, the world around him did not grow calmer. It grew more complicated, because reform inside a single region cannot exist untouched when surrounding territories operate under different rules. And the Senegal River that nourished his land also connected it to wider political currents moving across West Africa and toward the Atlantic coast. To the west along the coast, French trading posts had been active for decades, especially at St. Louis, where merchants negotiated for gum, Arabic, gold, hides, and human beings. And these traders did not control the interior directly, but they influenced it through alliances, gifts, weapons, and promises of profit. And their presence created constant pressure on inland rulers to maintain supply lines. South and east of Futatoro lay other states with their own ambitions, some of them deeply involved in slave raiding and trading, and these rulers observed Abdul Kader Kane's reforms with caution and sometimes suspicion, because if his policies spread, they could disrupt established patterns of wealth and power. The Senegambian region at this time was not isolated from global events. European rivalries influenced trade competition, and wars between European powers could alter which merchants had stronger positions along the coast. And these shifts affected inland politics indirectly, because access to firearms and goods depended on these coastal connections. Abdul Kader Kane understood that moral reform alone would not secure his state. He needed political strategy, and one of his key challenges was balancing firmness with diplomacy. He had to signal clearly that unjust enslavement would not be tolerated in his territory. Yet he also needed to avoid provoking a coalition of enemies who might see him as a threat to their survival. His government began regulating who could be enslaved under Islamic law, emphasizing that free Muslims could not be sold into slavery, and this may sound straightforward, but in practice determining who was Muslim and whether a person had been captured lawfully was often contested, and disputes could escalate quickly. Traders who had grown accustomed to flexible interpretations of status now faced scrutiny, and some accused the Almamese officials of interfering with legitimate commerce, while supporters argued that justice required such intervention. Beyond economics, there was the matter of security, because restricting slave raiding could anger neighboring groups who relied on captives as part of their own political systems, and anger can turn into armed confrontation. Reports began circulating of tension along borders, small skirmishes, disputes over grazing land intertwined with accusations of harboring runaways or blocking trade routes, and every incident risked escalating into larger conflict. Abdul Kader Kane's authority rested heavily on religious legitimacy, and he invested in strengthening networks of scholars who could reinforce his moral stance. Schools were supported, legal scholars were consulted, and sermons emphasized accountability before God. And this created a strong ideological foundation that distinguished Futatoro from more commercially driven states. Yet ideology does not feed armies or replace lost revenue, and the economic consequences of reform slowly became visible. Certain elites who once profited from trade found their incomes reduced, and dissatisfaction can undermine even the most principled leadership. Some nobles quietly questioned whether the Almamese strict policies endangered the prosperity of the region, and whispers of dissent moved through courtyards and markets. Because when money flows differently, alliances shift. At the same time, European traders adapted pragmatically. If one region limited supply, they intensified efforts elsewhere, strengthening ties with rulers more willing to provide captives, and this dynamic meant that Abdul Kader Kane's moral stand did not end the slave trade. It reshaped its geography, and this reality added a layer of tragic tension to his mission, because even sincere reform faced the limits of a vast transatlantic system driven by global demand. Still, his stance mattered deeply within his territory, because families who might have feared sudden raids felt greater security, and the psychological impact of leadership that opposed unjust enslavement cannot be underestimated. It altered how people viewed their rule. As Abdul Kader Kane moved deeper into the later years of his rule, the excitement of early reform gave way to the slow and demanding work of preservation, because creating anew. Order is one challenge, but sustaining it across seasons, droughts, rivalries, and generational shifts is another. And this stage of his leadership would test not only his conviction, but the resilience of the institutions he had built since 1776. The people of Futa Toro had grown accustomed to a ruler who spoke openly about justice and accountability before God, and this consistency strengthened loyalty among scholars, farmers, herders, and ordinary families who valued security over profit from human trade. Yet the broader region did not pause in its economic pursuits, and coastal demand for captives continued, driving neighboring states to intensify their own involvement in slave raiding, which created both humanitarian and political strain along Futa Toro's borders. The Almami understood that stability required not only moral clarity but also economic adaptation. So efforts were made to strengthen agriculture along the Senegal River, encouraging productivity that could support the population without reliance on slave commerce. And this focus on local prosperity reflected a deeper principle, that independence from unjust systems begins with self-sufficiency. Yet such transitions are rarely smooth, and merchants who had once profited from trading captives had to redirect their skills toward other goods, a shift that required time and patience. Some accepted the change, recognizing that long-term stability benefited everyone, while others quietly longed for the faster wealth that the Atlantic trade once provided. And this tension between short-term gain and long-term security remained a constant undercurrent. Meanwhile, neighboring rulers observed Futa Toro's internal adjustments with mixed feelings. Some admired the discipline and cohesion that reform had produced, while others viewed it as an ideological threat that could inspire dissent within their own territories, and in regions where authority was often maintained through force and profit. The idea that governance could prioritize moral law unsettled established hierarchies. Reports reached Abdul Kader Kane of continued raids in adjacent lands, villages attacked, captives marched toward coastal markets, and such news deepened his resolve while also reminding him of the limits of his reach, because even a principled state cannot shield every community beyond its borders. This reality forced difficult decisions about foreign policy, whether to intervene militarily in neighboring conflicts or to focus inward on strengthening his own society. An intervention risked overextension, while restraint risked appearing indifferent. And navigating this dilemma required careful judgment. Within Futa Toro, educational efforts expanded. Quranic schools trained new generations. Judges were instructed in applying Islamic law consistently, and administrative systems matured beyond reliance on a single personality, because Abdul Kader Kane recognized that reform tied too closely to one leader could unravel upon his passing, and therefore institutional depth became essential. Still, human nature cannot be erased by decree, and power struggles occasionally resurfaced among local elites who sought influence under the new order, testing the Almami's ability to maintain unity without sliding into harsh repression. His approach often combined firmness with dialogue, reminding dissenters that the legitimacy of governance derived from adherence to justice rather than personal ambition, and this steady articulation of principle reinforced his moral authority even when practical compromises were necessary. As the wider Atlantic world edged toward new political transformations in the late 1700s, European colonial ambitions in Africa were slowly intensifying, not yet the full-scale colonization that would come in later centuries, but a growing appetite for direct influence, and coastal forts served as footholds for deeper engagement. And though Futa Toro remained inland, it could not ignore these developments, because economic and military currents originating overseas inevitably flowed upriver. Abdul Kader Kane's stance against unjust enslavement placed him in a complex position, resisting certain practices while coexisting with a global trade system beyond his direct control. And this paradox defines much of his legacy. He was both constrained by his era and courageous within it. As he aged, his presence carried weight beyond immediate policy. He became a symbol of principled leadership, a reminder that African rulers were not uniformly complicit in the slave trade. The debates over morality and governance occurred within African societies themselves, and that resistance to exploitation did not begin only when Europeans imposed colonial rule in later centuries. The suspense in this phase of his story lies not in dramatic battles, but in the quiet endurance of reform, because sustaining justice amid pressure is often less visible, yet equally significant. Communities along the Senegal River continued their lives with greater confidence that arbitrary raids would not originate from their own leadership. Children grew up hearing that their ruler had declared unjust enslavement unlawful, and this narrative shaped collective identity, embedding a sense of dignity tied to faith and governance. Yet uncertainty lingered about the future. Would successors maintain the same commitment? Would economic temptations resurface with new force? Would external powers exploit any internal division? And such questions hung in the air as Abdul Kader Kane's years advanced. His leadership did not end the Atlantic slave trade, but it demonstrated that alternatives were possible, that African states could challenge participation in the system from within, and that moral arguments could influence policy even amid global demand. As we move journey, we will examine how his later years and eventual passing influenced Futatoro's trajectory, how his successors navigated the inheritance of reform, and how historians today interpret his place in West African history, revealing the depth of his impact beyond a single decade. If you are still following this journey, write Principles Over Profit in the comments. Share this story with someone who believes Africa lacked internal debates about slavery, and remain with Erased But Not Gone as we continue uncovering the enduring legacy of Abdul Kader Kane. As the later years of Abdul Kader Kane approached their final stretch, the question that quietly hovered over Futatoro was no longer only about reform, it was about continuity. Because every movement rooted in strong leadership must eventually confront the reality of succession. And the strength of any system is revealed when its founder is no longer present to guide it. By the time the Almami had ruled for years after 1776, his authority was not merely political but symbolic. He represented a turning point in the history of the Senegal River Valley, a moment when moral conviction reshaped governance. And that symbolic power unified many communities. Yet symbols can be fragile if not anchored in durable institutions. Within Futa, Toro scholars who had supported his rise understood this danger clearly. They knew that without consistent enforcement of Islamic law and disciplined administration, the state could drift back toward older patterns of elite competition and economic temptation. And therefore, they intensified efforts to preserve the structures that had defined the reform, training judges, educating youth, and reinforcing communal identity through sermons and legal practice. Yet human ambition does not disappear simply because principles are declared, and among noble families, some individuals calculated how future transitions might create opportunities to regain influence, because politics is rarely still beneath the surface. As Abdul Kader Kane aged beyond his mid-40s into later life, he continued to emphasize that leadership must remain accountable before God. And this repeated message served as both instruction and warning to those who would follow, reminding them that legitimacy derived not from wealth or weapons, but from justice. The Senegal River Valley remained economically active. Agriculture sustained local communities. Trade in goods other than captives continued. And relative stability persisted within Futatoro's borders, compared to regions where slave raiding remained common. And this contrast itself strengthened public appreciation for the Almami's policies. However, the broader West African environment was shifting slowly. European coastal presence was consolidating. Commercial interests were deepening. And though the full wave of colonial conquest would come later, the groundwork of influence was being laid. And this long horizon added another layer of uncertainty to the future of reformist states like Futa Toro. When Abdul Kader Kane eventually passed from leadership, his departure marked the end of an era, yet it did not immediately erase his impact, because the institutions he had cultivated continued operating, at least for time, guided by the memory of his example and the legal frameworks he had established. Successors faced immediate tests. Internal factions evaluated whether to push boundaries. Neighboring rulers reassessed their strategies. And merchants observed closely to see if restrictions on unjust enslavement would soften. And this moment revealed how deeply reform had penetrated society. In the early period after his rule, Futa Toro did not collapse into chaos, which suggests that his governance had indeed created structural resilience rather than mere personal loyalty. Yet over time, pressures inevitably returned, because economic incentives tied to the Atlantic trade remained powerful across the region, and not all leaders possessed the same balance of conviction and political skill. Historians examining this era note that reform movements in West Africa often face cycles of renewal and decline, as initial fervor encountered the realities of generational change, and Futa Toro was no exception. Yet Abdul Kader Kane's tenure stands out because it clearly articulated a moral opposition to the unjust sale of Muslims into slavery at a time when the Atlantic system was expanding. Modern scholarship has increasingly highlighted this fact, challenging simplified narratives that portray African societies as uniformly complicit in the slave trade, and instead revealing internal debates, conflicts, and resistance that complicate the historical picture. His story reminds us that Africa was not a passive backdrop to European exploitation, but a continent of dynamic political actors making difficult choices under immense pressure. The suspense in reflecting on his legacy lies in recognizing both achievement and limitation. He did not end the transatlantic slave trade, yet within his sphere he altered policy, protected communities, and demonstrated that governance could align with moral law even in a brutal global economy. For people living along the Senegal River during his era, the difference was tangible. Raids became less frequent within his territory. Legal recourse became more structured. And a sense of shared purpose rooted in faith strengthened communal bonds. And these outcomes matter even if they did not transform the entire Atlantic system. Today, scholars studying West African Islamic reform movements often place Abdul Kader Kane among early figures who linked religious renewal with social justice, setting precedents that would influence later movements across the region in the 1800s. And through this broader lens, his decision in 1776 becomes part of a longer trajectory of African agency. As we draw the curtain, we must gather these threads together, the moral courage of a scholar who challenged profitable injustice, the political complexity of balancing reform with survival, the economic realities of a global trade network, and the enduring lesson that resistance can begin at home before it reaches the world stage. As we bring this journey to its conclusion, reflecting on what Abdul Kader Kane's life teaches us about power, conscience, and the hidden histories that deserve remembrance, and why his name belongs among the many African leaders who chose principle over profit in one of history's darkest eras. If you are still here, write Legacy of Courage in the comments. Share this story with someone who believes African history is simple, or one-sided, and stay with Erased but Not Gone for the final reflection on the life and impact of Abdul Kader Kane. As we come to the final point of this long and powerful journey, we must step back and see Abdul Kader Kane not only as a ruler of Futa Toro in 1776, but as a symbol of something larger, a reminder that history is never as simple as it is often told, and that within Africa itself there were fierce debates, bold reforms, and moral struggles during the height of the transatlantic slave trade. When we hear about the Atlantic slave system, we often imagine European ships, coastal forts, and distant plantations across the ocean. But we do not always look inland. We do not always ask who resisted within Africa, who argued against selling human beings, who risked power and profit for principle. And that is why this story matters so deeply. Abdul Kader Kane, in his mid-40s, stood at a crossroads of faith, politics, and economics, and he chose a path that disrupted powerful interests. He did not command fleets. He did not control coastal forts. He did not possess the global reach of European empires. Yet within his territory, he made a declaration that shook established networks. He insisted that unjust enslavement, especially of fellow Muslims, was unlawful. And in doing so, he challenged not only local elites, but the logic of a trade system feeding plantations across the Atlantic. That decision required courage because it meant confronting neighbors who profited from raids. It meant resisting economic temptation. It meant facing potential isolation, and it meant leading with moral clarity in a time when compromise might have been easier. The suspense that surrounded his rule was not about one dramatic battle, but about whether principle could survive pressure, whether a reformist state could endure in a region shaped by competition and external demand, and whether a scholar could transform moral teaching into lasting governance. For years, Futa Toro experienced a different model of leadership, one that prioritized religious law and community protection over unchecked trade in human lives. And while this did not end slavery across West Africa, it created a space of relative security for many families along the Senegal River. Think about what that meant in practical terms. Fewer sudden raids within his territory, greater confidence that leadership would not sell its own people for weapons or goods, stronger institutions grounded in education and legal structure, and a collective identity shaped by justice rather than fear. These achievements are often overshadowed in global narratives, yet they matter profoundly because they reveal that resistance did not always appear as open war against Europeans. Sometimes it appeared as internal reform, as refusal, as policy change that limited participation in exploitation. Over time, the pressures of the Atlantic world continued. The slave trade did not vanish. Neighboring states maintained their own strategies, and European influence deepened gradually along the coast. But the legacy of Abdul Kader Kane endured in memory and in institutional foundations that influenced later movements of Islamic reform in West Africa. His example contributed to a broader tradition of leaders who linked faith with social justice, reminding future generations that governance could be measured not only by wealth or military strength, but by moral accountability. When we study history carefully, we begin to see patterns, reform movements rising in response to corruption, leaders emerging from scholarly backgrounds rather than purely military ones, communities choosing alignment with principle even at economic cost. And these patterns complicate the simplified narrative that Africa was merely a supplier in the slave trade without internal opposition. Abdul Kader Kane's story invites us to recognize African agency in all its complexity, including moments of resistance that did not align neatly with European timelines. His life teaches that change often begins locally, that challenging injustice within one's own society can be as significant as confronting external forces, and that the courage to stand against profitable wrongdoing carries ripple effects far beyond immediate borders. As we reflect on the tension he navigated between diplomacy and firmness, between survival and reform, between economic pressure and spiritual duty, we gain a deeper understanding of leadership under constraint. Because he did not operate in a world of simple choices, he operated in a world where every decision carried consequence. The river that flowed beside his state continues today, its waters still moving through Senegal and Mauritania, and along its banks, echoes of that reform era remain part of regional memory, a reminder that moral conviction once reshaped governance there. For us today, the question is not only what he achieved, but what we learn from it. Do we recognize hidden chapters of resistance in places rarely highlighted? Do we appreciate that debates over justice existed within African societies themselves? Do we challenge narrow narratives that erase complexity? This is why Erased But Not Gone exists, to uncover these layers, to bring forward names that deserve attention, to show that history is richer and more contested than surface summaries suggest. If this story has opened your eyes to a different dimension of West African history, if it has shown you that resistance can take the form of reform and principled governance, then do not let this knowledge remain silent. Tell us in the comments the city and country you are watching from, because this community spans continents. Share this video with someone who believes African leaders were passive participants in the slave trade. Subscribe if you have not yet done so.